Summer had come to an end, but the scent of sunlight and freedom still lingered in the morning air. In the schoolyard, students were calling out to each other with excitement, some sharing stories of their vacations, while others hurried off to their classes. For Liam, this wasn't just another ordinary day. It was a new beginning, in a new school, surrounded by faces he didn't recognize. The sunlight streamed through the windows of room 203, casting long shadows on the freshly waxed floor. Liam sat quietly at his desk, his fingers pressed against the edge of his new textbook. His dark eyes carefully examined every detail of the classroom, from the motivational posters on the walls to the empty seats gradually filling with classmates. This school was different from his old one. The hallways were wider, the students' lockers were a unique shade of blue, and even the air smelled unfamiliar, a mix of fresh paint, cleaning supplies, and a hint of lemon. Without thinking, he ran his hand through his hair, the hair his grandmother had carefully styled the night before. "You look so handsome," she had said with a tired smile, a smile that gave Liam the courage to step into this new world with confidence. But what none of the students knew, and none of the teachers had realized yet, was that Liam's father was, in fact, the new principal of the school, Mr. Carter. They had decided to keep this secret for the time being. "Let's let you make some friends first," his father had said that very morning over breakfast, while adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror. As students filtered into the classroom, groups of friends began to form. Friends who had known each other since kindergarten talked about their summers and new classes, comparing their plans. Liam took out his notebook. Its blank pages were ready to hold a new story. Just then, the door to the classroom opened, and Mrs. Wheeler entered, the teacher with gray hair neatly tied back and lips pressed into a thin, serious line. She began taking attendance, carefully reading each student's name. When she reached Liam's name, she paused for a brief moment, a subtle change in her expression that only someone paying close attention would notice. All morning, Liam tried his best to adjust to the environment, raising his hand when he knew the answer, staying silent when he didn't, and following the teacher's instructions to the letter. But every time he looked up, he caught Mrs. Wheeler's gaze, a look that lingered just a little too long on him. Her smile never reached her eyes. During the first writing exercise of the class, Liam began writing carefully. He wrote about his family's trip to the science museum, the experiments they had done in the interactive lab, and his dream of becoming a scientist. When he handed in his paper, Mrs. Wheeler didn't even glance at it, placing it at the bottom of the stack. At lunch, a friendly boy named Noah invited him to sit with them at their table. They talked about video games, favorite subjects, and the school's science fair. For a moment, Liam felt that maybe this new school wasn't so bad after all. But when they returned to class after lunch, he realized that Mrs. Wheeler's gaze was still heavy on him. When she handed back the graded papers, Liam stared at the red marks on his sheet. It was as though someone had angrily scribbled over his paper. The grade at the top, C, left him frozen in place. He had never received a grade lower than a B+ in his life. He glanced around. The other students were comparing their papers. Most had received A's or B's. Noah, sitting right next to him, had written an essay nearly the same length, yet his grade was an A. Liam swallowed his lump in his throat, put the paper in his folder, and tried to ignore the heavy feeling in his chest. As the day wore on, little incidents piled up, one after the other. Mrs. Wheeler interrupted him twice while he was answering, something she hadn't done to anyone else. When he asked for permission to sharpen his pencil, she made him wait until 3 other students had finished. During art class, Mrs. Wheeler walked past Liam's desk without even glancing at his work. Meanwhile, a few desks away, she took time for each of the other students in his row, offering help and guiding them with a warm smile. When the final bell rang, Liam let out a sigh of relief. As he packed his books into his bag, he wondered whether he should talk to his father about this strange day or not. He knew his father would want to hear how he was doing, but something inside him held him back. Maybe things would be better tomorrow. Maybe Mrs. Wheeler was just having a bad day. Maybe all of this was just his imagination. On his way out of the building, he passed his father's office. Through the glass door, he saw him talking to one of the teachers. Just then, Mr. Carter looked up and gave a small, encouraging nod. Liam tried to smile and, tightening his grip on the strap of his backpack, continued on his way. That night, when his mother asked about his first day at school, Liam just shrugged and said, "It was fine." But as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger than he expected was coming. Still, his grandmother's voice echoed in his mind. "Hold your head up. Be proud of yourself." Tomorrow was another day, another opportunity to prove himself, and he was determined to face it with courage. As weeks passed, the cool autumn air brought more than just changes in the color of the leaves. In room 203, the tension between Liam and Mrs. Wheeler grew heavier each day. He had now learned the school routine, but the teacher's behavior toward him was no longer something he could ignore. Even his classmates had started noticing it. One morning, when Liam went to the board to solve a math problem, Mrs. Wheeler stood directly behind him and, with an exasperated sigh, stamped her foot on the floor. "We don't have all day." Her voice was so sharp that several students looked up from their notebooks. Liam carefully wrote the answer on the board, a perfectly correct answer, but Mrs. Wheeler didn't even glance at it, simply saying dryly, "Sit down." A few minutes later, when Sophia, a girl with short, braided hair, solved a similar problem, one with 2 mistakes, Mrs. Wheeler's tone completely changed. "Don't rush, sweetheart. Math is tough, but you're doing great." The difference in behavior was so obvious that Noah, who sat in the row next to Liam, raised his eyebrows and gave Liam a meaningful glance. At lunch, Noah finally broke the silence. While spinning his apple on his tray, he said, "My mom's a teacher. She says teachers shouldn't treat students differently." Liam shrugged and tried to seem indifferent, but inside, he was filled with turmoil. Things got worse when it was time for the heritage presentations. Each student had to talk about their family's background. When Liam spoke about his grandmother and her involvement in social movements, when he shared the deep history of his family in the town, suddenly, in the middle of his speech, Mrs. Wheeler stopped him in a dry tone. "That's enough, it's time for the next one," even though there were still 2 minutes left in his presentation. But when the next student, unrelated to the class topic, spent 3 extra minutes talking about their summer vacation, Mrs. Wheeler smiled and praised them. What an amazing explanation! Word of Mrs. Wheeler's behavior slowly spread beyond room 203. Some teachers had begun to notice that she made unpleasant remarks about Liam's hair at lunchtime. "I don't understand why they can't style their hair normally." She said this loudly enough for several other teachers to hear. Most of them clearly felt uncomfortable, but only a few dared to speak up. One of the few teachers who openly became concerned was Mr. Kwan, the science teacher. He passed by room 203 several times under various pretexts, especially when he heard Mrs. Wheeler's loud voice from inside. One time, right after hearing her harsh tone, he even entered the class to erase chalk from the board. His presence for a few moments calmed the atmosphere, but he couldn't always be there. One day, while Mrs. Wheeler was grading papers, she picked up Liam's sheet with 2 fingers, as if touching something unpleasant. "This handwriting is completely illegible." Several students stared at her in surprise. Liam held his breath as he took his paper back. His handwriting was neat, as always. But it seemed nothing was ever good enough. Miss Wheeler announced loudly that Liam's handwriting was unreadable, even though his writing was as neat as that of the other students. When she marked a D on his paper, Noah, who had later read his essay, exclaimed in shock, "This is one of the best essays I've ever read." Gradually, other students began to notice the recurring patterns. How Ms. Wheeler would wrinkle her nose in disgust as she walked past Liam's desk. How she ignored his raised hand during class discussions. How, even when he was silent and absorbed in his work, every noise seemed to be blamed on him. But some students began to show support for Liam, even if in small ways. They would deliberately repeat answers they knew he had gotten right. Or they would ask him for help with their assignments, just where Ms. Wheeler could see. A few even changed their hairstyles to show solidarity, though they didn't fully understand the depth of the situation. In other classes, Liam was still a brilliant student. In Mr. Kwan's science class, his experiments were always creative and precise. In art class, his projects were displayed in the school hallway. In gym class, he was always one of the first chosen for teams. But in Miss Wheeler's class, his grades gradually but steadily declined. At home, Liam began to suffer from insomnia. He stayed awake at night, running simple answers through his mind, afraid that he would make a mistake in class the next day. His mother had noticed that he talked less at the dinner table, pushing his food around more than actually eating it. Some mornings, when he arrived at school, he saw his father's car already parked in the lot. He knew Mr. Carter was trying to make the school a better place, holding meetings about inclusive education and student well-being. This contradiction struck Liam as funny, but he still couldn't bring himself to speak up about what was happening in room 203. Recent parent-teacher meetings with Ms. Wheeler had made some parents notice something strange. It seemed she had two completely different faces. She would lavish praise on some students while always finding fault with others. Her behavior pattern was becoming evident to everyone. Everyone except those who could actually do something about it. The tension was mounting, like a pot about to boil over. Teachers exchanged worried looks in the hallways. Students whispered about the situation under their breath. Even the school secretary had begun writing down things she overheard. Everyone sensed that something was going to happen. Only no one knew when or how. All this time, Liam had been thinking about his grandmother's words about self-respect and perseverance. Every morning, he walked into class with his head held high. He completed his assignments flawlessly and kept his spirits up. But even the strongest spirits can bend a little. Something was changing, and this change was about to reach room 203 sooner than anyone expected. That Wednesday afternoon in the art room was filled with excitement. Colorful posters for the fall festival covered the walls, and the warm October sun cast golden squares on the floor. The students were quietly buzzing as they worked on decorations for the school hallways. Liam sat at his usual spot, carefully cutting orange paper into pumpkin shapes. His project was going well. He had finished 2 pumpkins and was working on a third. Next to him, Noah was struggling to cut autumn leaves with scissors, but what he produced looked more like a modern abstract design. Ms. Wheeler moved between desks with a box of craft supplies. That day, she was unusually silent, her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. When she reached Liam's desk, she paused longer than usual, staring at the neat and organized space of his work. "Finally learned how to follow instructions," she said, her tone still carrying that hidden sharpness behind the smile, the kind of tone that made Liam's shoulders tense involuntarily. He kept his gaze fixed on his work, pretending to fine-tune the curve of the pumpkin's stem. A few students around them glanced up, but quickly turned their heads away. The atmosphere in the room shifted for a moment, like the quiet before a storm. The art room had gotten used to these tense moments, but that didn't make seeing them any easier. The atmosphere grew noticeably heavy and silent. "We need glue over here," a voice called from the back of the room. Miss Wheeler turned, and Liam took a deep breath, realizing just how much he had been holding it in. He reached for his water bottle and took a sip to calm his nerves. A few minutes passed in relative silence. Liam finished his third pumpkin and began designing a border for his display. The class discussions returned to their usual flow. talks about weekend plans and the upcoming science fair. And then, suddenly, he felt it. Something cold and sticky poured onto his head. For a brief moment, he thought someone had spilled his water bottle, but this felt different, thicker, stickier. His heart started pounding wildly. He reached up to touch his hair. Ms. Wheeler was standing right behind him, holding an open bottle. Before his fingers confirmed what had happened, a sharp chemical smell hit his nose. Superglue. Not the washable glue they used for crafts, but the industrial strength kind, locked away in the supply cabinet. The class immediately fell into a deadly silence. Someone audibly held their breath. A pencil dropped to the floor, its sound echoing in the unnatural quiet of the room. "Oh no." Ms. Wheeler's voice rang out, feigning concern and surprise. "What a terrible accident. I must have grabbed the wrong bottle." Liam remained motionless. His hands were still touching his hair. The same hair he had always carefully kept neat. The hair his grandmother had helped him style since childhood. The hair that connected him to his family roots. And now it was covered in glue that couldn't be washed out. A distinct sound came from behind him. A click. Someone was taking a picture with a phone. Then another click. For a moment, Ms. Wheeler's face shifted. Something like fear passed through her expression. "I'll go get some tissues," she said, turning around. But everyone knew that tissues wouldn't help. This glue wasn't the kind that came off with water. Noah stood up. "I'm getting the nurse." His voice trembled, but there was anger bubbling beneath it. Before Ms. Wheeler could speak, he rushed out of the class. The other students began to move too. Sophia, who sat in front of Liam, took a deep breath and found the courage to speak. "That wasn't the wrong bottle," she said, her voice firm and clear. "The craft glue comes in plastic bottles with orange caps. That glue was in the locked cabinet." Other voices rose in agreement. "You needed a key to access that glue. I saw you take it before class. You didn't give glue to anyone else." Ms. Wheeler's face drained of color. She clearly realized it was too late. How many witnesses were in the room? How many students had recorded the scene? How many more had finally found the courage to break their silence? Liam still hadn't moved. The glue was hardening in his hair, creating an uncomfortable sensation on his scalp. But in that specific moment, something within him shifted. The fear and anxiety of the past few weeks turned into something different, a quiet strength, an inner certainty that this time he wasn't going to let it go unanswered. From the open door of the classroom, the sound of quick footsteps echoed. The school nurse was coming, and with her, questions would start. What happened? Who is responsible for this? Why? Meanwhile, in the principal's office, Mr. Carter, Liam's father, was working, unaware of everything that had transpired. But soon, his role as both principal and father would take him down a path that would change everything. Ms. Wheeler stood by her desk, her hands trembling slightly, trying to appear as though she was searching for tissues. But the evidence was clear. The bottle of superglue still in her hands, the security camera in the corner of the room, dozens of students who had witnessed the incident, and the determined look in their eyes. This time, no one would stay silent. The school nurse's office was usually quiet in the afternoons, but not today. The news spread throughout the building like fire in the wind. Whispers and urgent text messages were exchanged among the students. Those passing by the nurse's office slowed their pace, trying to see through the frosted glass. Inside the office, Nurse Baker was carefully assessing the damage to Liam's hair using warm water. Her face remained calm, but her eyes burned with anger. She was documenting everything, taking photos with her phone, knowing that an official investigation would begin soon. "It's starting to burn," Liam said quietly, wincing as he touched a sticky spot on his scalp, his face contorting in pain. The sharp smell of superglue filled the small office, mixing with the usual scent of disinfectants in the nurse's room. Outside in the hallway, Noah paced back and forth. He had positioned himself as a guard, fending off any curious onlookers and waiting for the principal's arrival. A few other art class students had joined him, forming a supportive circle around the nurse's office. They were busy sending videos they had taken to each other, making sure there were multiple copies of the evidence. Ms. Wheeler stood awkwardly against the wall. Her previous confidence had completely vanished. She kept smoothing her skirt and jumped every time the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. "This was an accident," she muttered, not to anyone in particular. Just a simple mistake in grabbing the wrong bottle. Sophia, who had stayed behind to testify, spoke up from her seat. "The craft glue is in plastic bottles," she said, her voice now firmer. "The superglue is kept in the locked cabinet. You were supposed to use the key to access it." The nurse stopped working and looked directly at Min Wheeler. "Superglue can cause chemical burns," she said, her professional tone now firm and assertive. "This is not a simple mistake. This is a serious issue." At that moment, the door opened. Everyone expected to see Principal Carter, but it was Mr. Chen, the science teacher, who rushed in. With a single glance, he took in Liam, the glue bottle on the counter, and the heavy atmosphere in the room. His face tightened. Without saying a word, he pulled out his phone and quickly began typing. "Principals at a district meeting," he explained, not looking up from the screen. "I sent him an urgent message. He'll be here in a few minutes." No one knew just how personal that message to Principal Carter would be. Minutes passed slowly. Nurse Baker continued her work kindly, documenting everything. Mr. Chen stood by the door, his usually warm expression now serious and determined. More teachers had gathered in the hallway, their murmurs filled with disbelief and concern. Then the sound of quick, firm footsteps echoed in the hallway. The crowd outside parted, and the door opened. Principal Carter stood in the doorway, his tall figure filling the entrance. For a moment, everything stopped. Ms. Wheeler's face turned pale. Her eyes widened in shock, as if she had just realized something important. She looked from Liam to Principal Carter, and back to Liam again, finally seeing the connection. Those same warm brown eyes, that same straight nose, that same dignity in their gaze. How had she not noticed the resemblance before? "Dad." Liam said it calmly, but that one word resonated in the silent room. For a brief moment, Principal Carter's face shifted noticeably. A deep sorrow and anger flashed through his expression. But with a visible effort, he returned his professional mask. When he spoke, his voice was completely controlled, but his authority echoed throughout the room. "Nurse Baker, please continue caring for my son. Mr. Chen, please contact the district office. We need a substitute teacher immediately." Then he turned to Ms. Wheeler, who was pressed against the wall, as if trying to disappear into it. "Ms. Wheeler, please come to my office and wait there." The students watched in admiration as their principal, with his son sitting in front of him covered in chemicals, managed the crisis with efficiency and calm. But they all knew this was just the beginning of the story. They watched as Principal Carter made important calls, documented everything, and ensured that all legal procedures were properly followed, while periodically checking on Liam's condition with a worried glance. Parents who had received their children's messages began to arrive one by one. They gathered in the main office, their angry voices echoing through the hallway. Ms. Lopez, the school secretary, struggled to answer the endless calls. Meanwhile, news arrived that Dr. Collins, the head of the district's education department, was on his way. Throughout all this, Liam remained silent in the nurse's office, an ice pack on his burned scalp. He watched his father manage the impossible situation, both as a principal and as a father. And for the first time, a new sense of pride began to form inside him. The secret he had kept for weeks had now been revealed. but in a way he never imagined. By late afternoon, the hallways had quieted, but the story was far from over. Social media was flooded with news of the incident. Community leaders were calling for immediate action, and an emergency school board meeting was being scheduled. In the nurse's office, father and son finally had a moment alone. Principal Carter sat in a chair next to Liam. His professional mask had cracked slightly, and he gently placed his hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm sorry, Liam." His voice was soft, but filled with emotion. "I didn't know it had gotten this bad." Liam looked at his father, seeing the pain and resolve in his eyes. "I know, Dad." He smiled faintly. "But now everyone knows. Maybe this is what had to happen." The sun was slowly setting outside the nurse's office window, casting long shadows across the floor. Father and son sat in silence, a shared understanding and a new strength growing between them. They both knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, this moment was enough. The next morning began with a heavy sense of urgency in the air, like the dark clouds before a storm. Principal Carter sat behind his desk, papers scattered across the surface, his phone constantly vibrating with messages and calls. Television reporters had been camped out at the school gates since dawn, their satellite antennas stretched up toward the gray sky. In the conference room at the end of the hallway, Ms. Wheeler sat alone, staring at her hands. She had been there since dawn, watching the teachers and staff arrive, their faces marked by sorrow and anger. She knew the emergency school board meeting would start soon, and it would likely be the end of her 20-year career. Dr. Collins was the first to arrive. His usually neat suit was slightly wrinkled, evidence of a sleepless night, filled with urgent calls and angry parent emails. As he entered the main office, Ms. Lopez handed him a thick folder. "These are all the complaints that have been filed against Ms. Wheeler over the years." Dr. Collins muttered under his breath as he flipped through the pages. How did we miss this? The file was filled with reports dating back 5 years, complaints of discrimination, unexplained grade changes, and violations that had never been pursued. The pattern was now clear, but only because someone had finally pieced together all the parts. Board members arrived one by one, their faces serious. They had all seen the video that had been circulating on social media the previous night. Shaky footage clearly showing Ms. Wheeler intentionally pouring superglue into Liam's hair. The timing and angles of the videos left no doubt. Principal Carter gazed out of his office window. More and more cars were entering the parking lot. Community leaders, civil rights activists, and angry parents. Their presence sent a clear message. This incident was not going to be easily forgotten. His phone buzzed again. It was a text from his wife. "I've taken Liam to the doctor. They're checking if the chemicals have caused any damage." A soft knock on the door made him rise. It was Mr. Chen, holding a stack of papers. His voice was calm but serious. "Sir, the students asked me to give you this." He placed the papers on the desk. Dozens of handwritten letters from Ms. Wheeler's class students, each detailing the events they had witnessed over the past few weeks. Principal Carter paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and picked up the first page. The story was not over, but now the truth would no longer stay hidden. He had always targeted Liam. One of the statements read, "But we were afraid to say anything because he was a teacher." "I saw him changing the grades," another student had written. Once, he erased Liam's answer and wrote a different one, just so he could mark it wrong. Principal Carter read each statement carefully, his heart heavy, knowing that his son had endured this behavior while he worked just a few steps away, unaware of everything. The professional distance he had always tried to maintain had unintentionally given Ms. Wheeler enough space to act without consequences. At 10 a.m., the doors to the conference room were closed for the emergency school board meeting. Ms. Wheeler sat on one side of the long table, her lawyer beside her, as board members filled the seats across from them. Dr. Collins stood at the front of the room, and the video of the incident silently played on the screen behind him. "We are here today," he began, his voice firm, "to address an issue that has exposed serious flaws in our system. But first, Miss Wheeler, do you have an explanation for your actions?" Her lawyer leaned forward to whisper something, but Ms. Wheeler shook her head. The innocent mask she had worn for years had completely crumbled. "I didn't know he was the principal's son," she said, as though this would justify her actions. One of the board members asked sharply, "Does that make a difference? Would you have treated him with at least a shred of human dignity if you had known?" The meeting went on for hours. Each complaint was reviewed, and every incident was discussed. Teachers came forward with their observations about the comments Ms. Wheeler had made in the teacher's lounge, attitudes they had witnessed, but hadn't challenged enough. Outside the building, the school had become the center of a larger conversation. Reporters were interviewing parents and community members, all calling for change. Social media was flooded with support for Liam and his father, with many sharing their own personal stories of discrimination they had experienced in schools. By late afternoon, decisions had been made. Ms. Wheeler's employment was immediately terminated. The board announced that all complaint procedures would be thoroughly reviewed, and mandatory training on bias and discrimination would be implemented for all staff. But everyone knew these were only the first steps in addressing a much deeper problem. Principal Carter spent the rest of the day in meetings with district officials, civil rights activists, and parent representatives. They discussed policy changes, new educational programs, and ways to create a more inclusive school environment. His dual role as both a principal and a father had given him a unique perspective, one that many found invaluable. As the evening approached, he finally had a chance to check his phone. He had a message from his wife. "Liam is okay. The doctor found some minor inflammation, but the burn is not serious. More importantly, he's holding his head high and not letting this affect his spirit." The last person to leave the school that night was the janitor. He paused in his work and saw Principal Carter standing in the empty hallway, looking at the student drawings on the walls, colorful pieces of art showcasing the diversity and beauty of the school community. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, in the quiet of the empty school, he could begin planning the changes that would ensure no student ever felt unsafe or excluded in these halls again. As he walked toward his car, he glanced up at the dark night sky. Sometimes, the hardest lessons come from the most painful experiences. The school would never be the same after today, and perhaps that was exactly what needed to happen. A week later, the school board meeting. The board meeting room, 1 week after the incident, was packed as much as possible. Some people were peering in through the windows of the meeting hall, familiar and new faces illuminated by the glow of their phone screens. At the front of the room, the board members sat behind a long table, their faces serious as they prepared to face the large crowd that had gathered to hear the responses. Liam sat between his parents in the front row, his hair covered with a soft hat. The chemical burns had mostly healed, but the damage to his hair required specialized treatment at a salon. His grandmother also sat beside them, her presence a steady pillar for the whole family. Dr. Collins, the district supervisor, stood behind the podium. The room fell silent as he adjusted the microphone. What happened at Springfield Middle School was not just an isolated incident, he began, his voice clear and determined. It was a wake-up call for our entire district. Behind him, a large screen displayed statistics that made many of the attendees hold their breath. Complaints about discriminatory behavior in schools across the district had been recorded, but most had been quietly reviewed or filed away without proper follow-up. The superglue incident had finally forced everyone to confront an uncomfortable truth. The system had betrayed many students for a long time. At the side of the hall, Ms. Wheeler sat with her lawyer. Her face, in just 1 week, appeared years older. The evidence against her was irrefutable. Not just the viral video, but years of documented complaints that had now come to light. Former students had come forward, sharing stories of her long-standing discriminatory behavior that could no longer be ignored. The board unanimously decided Ms. Wheeler's teaching license would be revoked. The district would fully cooperate with ongoing investigations by civil rights organizations. But most importantly, sweeping changes would be implemented across all schools. "We will form an independent review board," Dr. Collins announced. "Any complaint about discrimination will be immediately investigated. We will introduce new training programs, review our hiring processes, and establish diverse student councils in every school." Principal Carter went to the podium. Speaking both as a principal and a father, he addressed the room professionally and personally. "I've seen this issue from both sides," he said firmly. "We need to do better, and we will." He presented plans for Springfield Middle School, which would serve as a model for other schools. Regular cultural sensitivity training for all staff. A new curriculum that celebrates diversity. An anonymous system for reporting student safety concerns. Monthly meetings where students can voice their concerns directly to administrators. A movement for change was beginning. Community leaders stepped forward to support these changes. Local businesses offered to fund the new programs. Civil rights organizations volunteered to provide training. Parents formed committees to assist in the implementation of the new policies. What had started as a painful event had now transformed into a movement for positive change. Liam sat quietly between his parents, listening to all the developments. He thought of his friends at school, those who had supported him in that crucial moment. He thought of Mr. Chen, the teacher who had looked out for him from the very beginning. He thought of the students who might now have a better experience at school because of what had happened. During a break in the meeting, a young student approached him. "My little sister is coming to this school next year," she said softly. "Thanks to you, she'll be safer." Liam gave a small smile, suddenly realizing that his painful experience might protect others. The meeting continued into the afternoon. Lawyers discussed the legal ramifications. Teachers suggested changes to classroom policies. Students shared their experiences and ideas for creating more inclusive schools. Every voice was heard. Every suggestion was considered. Principal Carter watched all these developments from his seat, taking notes. He had already begun making changes at Springfield Middle School. Art supplies were now stored in locked, labeled boxes and were accessible to all students. Teachers were required to document their grading processes. A new counselor had been hired to support students facing discrimination. The path of change had begun, and there was no turning back. As the sun set and long shadows fell through the windows, the school board presented their final announcements. Ms. Wheeler would never be allowed to teach again. The school district would cover Liam's medical and hair restoration costs. New policies would be implemented before the start of the next school year. But the most important change wasn't written in any official document. It was in the looks now exchanged with more understanding and awareness. It was in the conversations now happening in hallways and classrooms, at dinner tables, and in neighborhood meetings. When Liam left the meeting hall, he felt different. The hat on his head still hid the damage to his hair, but now he walked with his head held high. His father's hand rested on his shoulder, both of them knowing that this painful experience had sparked a necessary change. "Great job, son," Principal Carter said quietly as they walked toward their car. "Sometimes the hardest moments lead to the most important changes." Liam nodded, thinking of the other students who would benefit from these new policies. It had been a painful event, but the school's and the community's response showed him that when people unite against injustice, real change is possible. That night, As the news crews packed up their equipment and the last cars left the parking lot, the setting sun bathed the school board building in golden light. Inside, the cleaning crew tidied up the meeting hall, while the board members finalized the last documents. Outside, new signs were being installed. Springfield School District, a place where every student belongs. 6 months after the incident, Springfield Middle School had transformed. There was a fresh energy in the hallways as students eagerly made their way to morning classes. New paint on the walls gleamed brightly, now adorned with student artwork, pieces celebrating diversity and acceptance. But the real changes went beyond the school's appearance. Liam confidently walked through the main entrance. His hair, now healthy and restored, was the result of careful work by his grandmother's friend, a specialist who had helped repair the damage. Students greeted him with warm smiles and clenched fists in greeting. Gone was the anxious boy who had started the school year. In his place stood a young person who had played a role in shaping positive change. The school's loudspeakers echoed with the morning announcements. Reminder: the Solidarity exhibition will be held next week. Liam smiled, recalling how this idea had come up during one of the new student council meetings. The exhibition was meant to showcase the diverse cultures, traditions, and stories of the school community. Liam's project, a presentation on the history and significance of different hairstyles, had attracted much attention. At the end of the hallway, Principal Carter stood, watching students pass by. The last 6 months had been challenging, but rewarding. The new policies were no longer just on paper. They were making a real impact on students' lives. The anonymous reporting system had prevented several instances of discrimination. Teachers were more aware, engaged, and willing to intervene when issues arose. Transformation in the teacher's space changes were also visible in the teacher's lounge. Ms. Lee, the new diversity education coordinator, was leading weekly discussion sessions. These sessions allowed staff to speak openly about their biases and learn from each other. The discussions were never easy, but they were necessary. Several teachers had confessed that witnessing Ms. Wheeler's downfall had forced them to examine their own unconscious biases. You're still coming to the elementary school next week, right? David, now the president of the new Student Diversity Council, approached Liam during lunch. This council had started a new outreach program, visiting elementary schools to talk about inclusivity and combating discrimination. No way I'm missing it, Liam responded, thinking about how much he had grown since that terrifying day in art class. Speaking up had been difficult at first, but now he understood the power of his own voice. Students began sharing their own stories, creating waves of awareness and change throughout the district. School administrators realized that these policies were spreading to other schools as well. Springfield Middle School had become a model, hosting teachers from other districts who wanted to learn from their experiences. Mr. Carter frequently held talks, sharing both the professional and personal aspects of their journey toward true inclusivity. In the afternoon, Liam attended one of the new after-school workshops. Today's session focused on cultural exchange, with students teaching each other about their family traditions. The room was packed. These voluntary sessions had become surprisingly popular, with students genuinely interested in learning about their classmates' backgrounds. Mr. Kwan, now the head of the school's inclusivity committee, stood by the door, watching with satisfaction. "You know," he said to Mr. Carter, who was standing nearby, "when I first started teaching here, I never imagined seeing changes like this." Later, Liam sat in his father's office, reviewing suggestions from the anonymous feedback box. They did this every week, carefully considering each comment. Some were simple requests for more culturally diverse food options in the cafeteria. Others offered thoughtful suggestions for new programs or raised concerns about ongoing issues. Each one was given careful consideration. "Look at this one," Liam said, holding up a note. "They want us to hold a monthly cultural heritage festival." His father nodded, adding it to the expanding list of student initiatives. The school had learned that the best ideas often came from the students themselves. As the day came to a close, Liam packed his books and paused for a moment to admire the new mural in the main hallway. This mural, created by students over several weekends, depicted a diverse group of young people standing together, with differences celebrated rather than hidden. He remembered how the whole school had contributed to its design, making it truly representative of their community. On their way home, Liam noticed a moving truck parked outside the school. "That's Ms. Wheeler's last belongings," Mr. Carter explained quietly. "She may have left, but her actions created changes that will continue to affect students for years to come." That evening, at a social dinner to celebrate the school's progress, Liam gave a speech. Looking at the faces of his classmates, teachers, and neighbors, he saw something that hadn't been there 6 months ago: genuine understanding, sincere connection, and a shared purpose. "What happened to me was painful," he said, his voice strong and clear. "But look at what we've made of it. Every student who walks through these doors now knows they have a place here. Every voice matters. Every story is worth hearing." The applause that followed Liam's speech wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who had played a part in transforming a moment of hate into a movement of hope. As the sun set, painting the sky with brilliant colors, Springfield Middle School stood as a testament to what can happen when a community stands up to discrimination and chooses to grow, learn, and change together. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and subscribe for more stories.